The carnival lights bled across the October sky in ribbons of red and gold, their reflections trembling on the dark horizon like the pulse of some restless dream. It was the final night of the Baldwin County Fair, the last Saturday of 1993, and Fairhope, Alabama had turned out in full. The air was thick with the mingled scents of corn dogs, cigarette smoke, and damp hay, all swirling beneath the flickering glow of neon signs that promised fortune, thrills, and escape. Somewhere amid the laughter and chaos, an old calliope wheezed its off-key tune, a melody so haunting that in years to come, people would still swear they could hear it in their sleep, the sound of that night refusing to fade. Sarah Beth Thornton stood near the carousel around 9:45 p.m., her blonde hair catching the fractured carnival light as painted horses rose and fell behind her. She was 19, caught between the innocence of her hometown and the restless ache of wanting more. She wore a faded denim jacket over a floral dress, white keds stained with Baldwin County's ever-present red clay. The wind tugged at the hem of her skirt as she folded her arms tightly, watching the swirl of faces and lights with an expression that seemed both expectant and uneasy. Several witnesses would later remember her, how she kept glancing at her watch, the small movements betraying a tension that didn't match the festive pulse around her. She looked like someone waiting for something, or someone, though no one could agree on what emotion flickered in her eyes. Was it impatience, fear, hope? Whatever it was, it didn't belong in that place of Ferris wheels and laughter. The last confirmed sighting came from Margaret Sullivan, the woman who manned the ticket booth beside the Ferris wheel. She remembered Sarah Beth clearly, said she was polite but distracted, her voice tight when she asked what time the fair would close. When Margaret told her it would run for another hour, the girl's face tightened with something close to frustration. Moments later, Margaret watched her walk away, toward the back edge of the fairgrounds, where the light gave way to shadow. That part of the fair was different, quieter, rougher. It was where the workers parked their trucks and trailers, where the air smelled of diesel and oil instead of popcorn and sugar. The hum of generators filled the dark spaces between tents, coughing out plumes of exhaust that drifted toward the empty fields beyond. Families didn't wander that way. It was the place where the carnival's bright illusion began to fray, where the laughter faded and the machinery showed its rust. That was the direction Sarah Beth walked, into the hum of engines and half-light, and then she was gone. By 11:30 p.m. the night had cooled. The fair's music had softened, the lights beginning to dim. Out in the dirt lot, Sarah Beth's younger sister Jennifer sat in the family's Buick, watching as the fair emptied around her. She had been waiting 20 minutes, maybe more, assuming Sarah Beth had run into old classmates or lost track of time. But as the crowd thinned and unease began to take root, a quiet panic that grew heavier with each passing minute. Sarah Beth was never late. She was careful, considerate, always the one to call, to reassure. When the clock ticked past 11 and there was still no sign of her, Jennifer's stomach clenched. She circled the fairgrounds twice before calling her mother. The Fairhope Police Department received the report at 11:58 p.m. Officer Frank Morrison was the one dispatched, a veteran of small-town fairs, used to noise and minor mischief. He knew this fair like he knew the backroads of Baldwin County, every ride operator, every food stand, every stretch of shadowed field. In 15 years, he'd handled countless calls just like this one, teenagers who'd slipped away to drink, couples sneaking into trucks, kids who'd turn up sheepish and embarrassed by dawn. That's what he told himself as he drove toward the fairgrounds, the red and blue lights reflecting off the rows of empty cars. But when he met Patricia Thornton, when he saw the way her hands trembled around a crumpled flyer, the way her eyes darted toward the fairground lights as if trying to will her daughter to appear, something shifted in him. There was no drama in her fear, no exaggeration, just a raw parental terror that cut straight through procedure. Morrison had seen worry before, but this was different. This was the kind of fear that knew, instinctively, immediately, that something irreversible had happened. And in that moment, beneath the fading carnival lights and the echo of the carousel's dying music, Officer Morrison felt it too, that Fairhope's annual fair would never again be remembered for its laughter or its lights, but for the night a young woman stepped into the dark and never came back. They searched the fairgrounds until nearly 3 in the morning, long after the last carnival light had flickered out, and the laughter that once filled the night had been replaced by the low hum of generators and the crunch of boots in dirt. Every ride operator, food vendor, and worker still dismantling tents or packing up equipment was questioned. The carousel stood motionless, its painted horses frozen mid-leap, their glossy eyes catching the beams of flashlights that sliced through the dark. Those same beams swept across the litter-strewn paths, discarded tickets, cigarette butts, crushed beer cans, the remnants of a night that had ended too soon for one girl. They called her name again and again, their voices growing hoarse, swallowed by the empty fields that stretched beyond the fairgrounds. The sound carried over the dewy grass and into the darkness like a prayer that went unanswered. It was the kind of night that seemed to hold its breath, as though even the air itself understood the weight of what was happening. At 4:17 a.m., just as the first thin light of dawn began to bleed across the Alabama horizon, Deputy Thomas Walsh found something, a glint of silver half buried in the dirt near the eastern fence line, where the carnival workers' trailers sat in a haphazard cluster. It was a bracelet, delicate, unmistakable, a small charm in the shape of Alabama dangling from its chain. When Patricia Thornton saw it, her hands trembled violently. She didn't need to look twice. Sarah Bates' grandmother had given her that bracelet for her 16th birthday. She'd worn it every day since, even to sleep. When the sun rose over Fairhope that Sunday morning, it did so with a kind of cold, cruel indifference, its bright light falling on a town that no longer felt safe. Chief of Police Robert Hamilton arrived at the fairgrounds around 6:30, his face lined with the weary understanding of a man who already knew this would become the defining case of his career. At 52, Hamilton had spent 3 decades in law enforcement, the last 10 as chief. He was a man who believed, perhaps naively, in the essential goodness of Fairhope, in the kind of community where people still left their doors unlocked and waved to each other on Front Street. He had handled his share of small-town troubles, bar fights, stolen bicycles, domestic disputes, but never something like this. Never a young woman who had simply vanished into the night without sound or trace. The area where the bracelet was found quickly became the heart of the investigation. It was a patch of worn grass about 30 feet from the nearest trailer, belonging to a ride operator named Curtis Doyle, a man who'd worked for the Fletcher family carnival for 7 years. The scene offered little. The ground was hardened by weeks of traffic, covered in overlapping footprints that rendered any forensic clues meaningless. There were no signs of a struggle, no torn fabric, no blood, nothing to suggest that violence had taken place there. The bracelet itself offered no answers. Its clasp was intact, unbroken. It could have been taken off, or it could have simply fallen. Still, Doyle became the first real person of interest. He was 41, his face deeply lined from years spent under the sun, his hands calloused and rough. He chewed a toothpick compulsively as he spoke, his voice flat and tired. He claimed he'd been in his trailer drinking with 3 other workers from around 10 until after midnight, playing cards and listening to the radio. The others confirmed his story, their recollections a little too uniform, each detail too neat, too rehearsed. Chief Hamilton had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize the rhythm of a story told in chorus, and he felt the familiar tug of suspicion. But without physical evidence, or even confirmation that a crime had occurred, he couldn't hold them. Not yet. By noon, the Alabama State Police had joined the investigation, bringing with them resources that the small Fairhope department could only dream of: search teams, portable floodlights, forensic experts, and most importantly, bloodhounds. The dogs were given one of Sarah Bates' shirts from home, still faintly scented with her perfume. Within minutes, they picked up a trail, noses low to the ground, handlers straining to keep pace as they followed an invisible path from the bracelet's location toward the parking lot. For a moment, hope flickered, but just as quickly it dimmed. Near the fair's entrance road, the dogs stopped, confused, circling and whining before losing the scent completely. The implication was obvious and devastating. Sarah Bate had likely left the fairgrounds in a vehicle. Whether she'd gotten in willingly or been forced was impossible to tell. And with hundreds of cars coming and going that night, locals, vendors, travelers, carnival workers, the possibility of finding the one that mattered felt as slippery as smoke. The clue was both everything and nothing, a thread without a knot to hold. As the long Sunday wore on, the carnival's skeleton remained scattered across the field. Half-torn posters fluttering in the wind, broken bulbs hanging from wire, the smell of diesel still lingering in the air. The fair that had brought joy to Fairhope for generations had transformed overnight into a crime scene, a place where innocence had been swallowed by the dark, and where every sound of the wind felt like the echo of a name still being called, unanswered into the dawn. The carnival workers became the obvious focus of suspicion. These were people who lived transient lives, moving from town to town, leaving no roots and few records. Background checks revealed a patchwork of minor offenses among them, misdemeanors and drunk and disorderlies, nothing violent, but enough to fuel the growing anxiety in Fairhope. Hamilton conducted over 40 interviews that first day, his small office overwhelmed with statements and alibis that all seemed to blur together. Everyone had seen something or thought they had, but none of it added up to anything solid. Meanwhile, search parties combed through the woods surrounding the fairgrounds, civilian volunteers joining law enforcement in a grid pattern that covered square miles of pine forest and abandoned farmland. They waded through drainage ditches and examined every building within a 2-mile radius. The local news stations arrived, their vans with satellite dishes transforming the quiet town into something resembling a media circus. Patricia Thornton appeared on camera, her voice breaking as she begged anyone with information to come forward, her husband standing beside her, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years overnight. On Monday morning, 72 hours after Sarah Bate was last seen, The Fletcher family carnival was scheduled to move on to their next location in Mississippi. Hamilton made the decision to hold them, a choice that required coordination with the state attorney general's office and created a legal and logistical nightmare. But he couldn't let them scatter across the South, couldn't risk losing access to potential witnesses or suspects. The carnival owner, Malcolm Fletcher, protested vehemently, talking about contracts and lost revenue, but eventually acquiesced under the weight of public pressure and the implicit threat of obstruction charges. The interviews continued, more intensive now. Investigators looked for inconsistencies and contradictions, examining the trailers, searching for any evidence that Sarah Beth had been inside one of them. They found nothing, no clothing fibers, no signs of her presence. The forensic capabilities of small-town Alabama in 1993 were limited, relying heavily on fingerprint analysis and visual evidence rather than the DNA testing that was still in its infancy. Air samples were collected, photographed, bagged as evidence, but without a body or a crime scene, they remained just possibilities, questions without answers, waiting in evidence boxes for technology that didn't quite exist yet. The interrogation room at the Fairhope Police Department smelled of stale coffee and decades of cigarette smoke that had seeped into the walls, despite the no-smoking policy implemented years earlier. Detective Linda Chambers sat across from another carnival worker, her notebook filled with statements that all seemed to say everything and nothing simultaneously. This one was Raymond Becker, 28 years old, who operated the tilt-a-whirl and had a lazy eye that made it difficult to tell where he was actually looking. He'd been with the Fletcher outfit for 3 seasons, drifting into carnival work after a stint in the army that ended without distinction. Becker claimed he'd spent most of that Saturday evening running his ride until shutdown at 10:30, then helped with preliminary breakdown before heading to the trailer he shared with 2 other workers. He remembered seeing Sarah Beth earlier in the evening, maybe around 8:00, standing near the ring toss game, talking to someone he couldn't identify from that distance. When Chambers pressed him on details, his story remained consistent but vague, in that frustrating way that could indicate either truthfulness or careful preparation. His hands never stopped moving as he talked, fingers drumming against the metal table, pulling at the collar of his flannel shirt, a constant restless energy that Chambers noted in her report. The problem was that everyone had an alibi, and everyone's alibi depended on someone else in the carnival crew. They were a self-contained ecosystem, these traveling workers, protective of their own in ways that made penetrating their stories nearly impossible. Curtis Doyle swore he was playing cards with Michael Patterson, Joseph Russo, and Dennis Clark. Patterson confirmed this, as did Russo and Clark, their timelines matching with the kind of precision that felt almost theatrical. When investigators tried to break them individually, applying the pressure techniques that usually revealed cracks in coordinated stories, they found nothing but consistent repetition. By Wednesday, 5 days after Sarah Beth's disappearance, the carnival was finally allowed to leave Fairhope. Chief Hamilton had exhausted every legal avenue to keep them, but without evidence of a crime, without even proof that anything criminal had occurred on fairground property, he had no grounds to hold them further. The workers packed up their equipment with an efficiency born of countless similar departures. The Ferris wheel dismantled into sections, the game booths collapsed and loaded onto trucks, the whole artificial world disappearing as if it had never existed at all. Residents of Fairhope lined the streets as the convoy rolled out, watching with expressions that mixed anger and helplessness, convinced they were watching a killer escape. Hamilton had managed to secure fingerprints from every carnival employee, 43 individuals total, ranging in age from 19 to 62. These prints were compared against the limited evidence collected at the scene, but the bracelet yielded nothing useful, too many surfaces too degraded by exposure to the elements. Hair samples taken from various trailers were preserved, labeled, and stored in the evidence room, waiting for forensic advances that seemed more like science fiction than practical investigative tools in 1993. The technology existed in major crime labs, but Baldwin County didn't have the budget or the connections to access it for what was still technically a missing person case rather than a confirmed homicide. Detective Chambers tracked the carnival's movements for months afterward, making phone calls to police departments in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Georgia as the Fletcher operation continued its circuit through the South. She asked local law enforcement to keep eyes on the workers, to note any suspicious behavior, to investigate if any other young women went missing in proximity to their stops. Nothing emerged. The carnival moved through town after town without incident, leaving behind only the usual debris of temporary entertainment, and taking with them whatever secrets they might have held. The investigation into the carnival workers gradually lost momentum, not from lack of effort, but from the simple reality that there was nowhere left to go. Every lead had been pursued to its dead end, every alibi checked and rechecked, every possible connection between Sarah Beth and the traveling fair examined until the threads wore thin and broke. Hamilton kept their files active, photographs of 43 faces pinned to a board in his office, men whose names he memorized and whose movements he tracked sporadically over the following years, but the initial intensity faded into the grinding frustration of a case gone cold. Sarah Beth Thornton had been born on a humid July morning in 1974, the first child of Patricia and Gerald Thornton, arriving 3 weeks early, as if already eager to engage with the world. She grew up in a modest ranch house on Magnolia Avenue, a street where neighbors still brought casseroles when someone was sick, and children played kickball in the cul-de-sac until the streetlights came on. Her childhood was unremarkable in the best possible way, filled with piano lessons she tolerated and softball games she genuinely loved. A girl who seemed to move through life with an easy confidence that made her popular without being threatening. At Fairhope High School, she'd been a B student who could have been an A student if she'd cared more about grades and less about people. Teachers remembered her as kind, the type who befriended the new kids and tutored struggling classmates without being asked. She worked part-time at Henderson's Fabric and Notions on Main Street, a small shop that smelled of cotton and mothballs, where elderly women came to buy quilting supplies and discuss their grandchildren. Mrs. Henderson, who'd owned the store for 30 years, said Sarah Beth had a gift for making customers feel heard, remembering their projects and asking about their families, turning a simple transaction into a genuine interaction. She'd started dating Michael David Collins in her junior year of high school, a relationship that seemed inevitable to everyone who knew them. Michael was the son of Robert Collins, who owned Collins Hardware, one of those establishments that had occupied the same corner for 3 generations. He was handsome in an understated way, dark hair kept neat, the kind of young man who opened doors and called adults sir and ma'am, who planned to take over his father's business someday and seemed perfectly content with that future. They were homecoming court material, the couple that made adults smile and say things like, "They'll get married young, you watch." The engagement had happened 6 months before Sarah Beth disappeared, on an April evening at the pier that extended into Mobile Bay. Michael had planned it carefully, bringing her there at sunset with a ring his grandmother had worn, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the fading light. She'd said yes immediately, according to Jennifer, who heard the story repeated so many times she could recite it like a prayer. They'd set a tentative date for June 1994, planning a modest ceremony at First Baptist Church, followed by a reception in the Fellowship Hall, nothing extravagant, but something meaningful, something that would anchor them both to this town and this life. In the weeks following her disappearance, investigators reconstructed Sarah Beth's final days with meticulous attention, searching for anything that seemed out of pattern, any argument or concern that might provide a motive for her to leave voluntarily or explain why someone might want to harm her. They found nothing alarming. Her last shift at Henderson's had been Friday afternoon, and Mrs. Henderson reported she'd seemed her normal self, maybe slightly distracted but nothing concerning, talking about the fair and how she was looking forward to going one last time before it left town. She'd had dinner with her family Friday evening, pot roast and mashed potatoes. Jennifer remembered watching television afterward before going to bed early. Saturday she'd spent running errands with her mother, stopping at the grocery store and the dry cleaners, picking up Michael's suit jacket that he'd need for a wedding they were attending the following weekend. She'd called Michael around 2 in the afternoon, a conversation he later described to police as completely normal, making plans to meet at the fair that evening around 9:30 after he finished helping his father with inventory at the hardware store. There was no argument, no tension, nothing that suggested their relationship was anything other than stable and happy. Friends interviewed by Detective Chambers painted a picture of a young woman who seemed genuinely content with her life, excited about her upcoming marriage, talking about the apartment she and Michael had put a deposit on above the drugstore on Section Street. Lisa Montgomery, her closest friend since middle school, said Sarah Beth had shown no signs of wanting to run away, had never expressed doubts about Michael or her future in Fairhope, had never mentioned feeling trapped or desperate to escape the small-town life that would inevitably be hers. The only slight irregularity investigators found was a withdrawal from her savings account the week before she disappeared, $200 taken out in cash. When asked about it, Patricia Thornton explained that Sarah Beth had been saving for wedding expenses and had mentioned needing to pay a deposit on flowers, though no florist in Fairhope or surrounding areas could confirm receiving payment from her. The money was never accounted for, a small mystery within the larger tragedy, the kind of detail that seemed potentially significant but led nowhere when pursued. Michael Collins himself became a focus of investigation, as romantic partners always do in missing person cases. He submitted to multiple interviews, voluntarily took a polygraph test that he passed, provided detailed accounts of his whereabouts that Saturday evening. He'd been at the hardware store until 9:15, his father confirmed, then driven directly to the fairgrounds, arriving around 9:35 to find the parking lot crowded and Sarah Beth nowhere in sight. He'd waited by the entrance for 20 minutes before going to look for her, assuming she was running late or had gotten caught up talking to someone. His grief appeared genuine, the kind of devastation that couldn't be manufactured, sitting in the Thornton living room for hours those first days, his face blank with shock, unable to process how someone could simply vanish from a crowded public place surrounded by witnesses. The first anniversary of Sarah Beth's disappearance arrived with the cruel indifference of changing seasons, October 1994, bringing the same crisp air and the same carnival that had rolled back into Baldwin County like a ghost returning to haunt the living. The Fletcher family carnival set up in a different location this time, 2 counties over, but the news still reached Fairhope and reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Patricia Thornton organized a vigil at the fairgrounds where her daughter had last been seen, now just an empty field of patchy grass and tire ruts, and nearly 300 people showed up, holding candles that flickered against the darkness like fragile prayers. Chief Hamilton attended that vigil, standing at the back of the crowd with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, watching the Thornton family and feeling the weight of his failure like a physical thing pressing against his chest. The case file sat in his office, grown thick with reports and statements and photographs that had yielded nothing substantial, a monument to investigative dead ends and the limitations of small-town resources. He'd pursued every lead with the kind of obsessive dedication that had strained his marriage and given him an ulcer, but the simple truth was that Sarah Beth Thornton had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed, leaving behind only absence and unanswered questions. Detective Chambers had transferred to Mobile in the spring of 1994, taking a position with a larger department where cases actually got solved, where there were forensic labs and experienced homicide detectives and resources beyond a handful of overworked officers trying their best with inadequate tools. Hamilton didn't blame her for leaving, but her departure felt like another kind of defeat, an acknowledgement that Fairhope didn't have the capacity to handle something this complex. The new detective assigned to the case, a young man named Aaron Bishop, reviewed the files with fresh eyes but found nothing his predecessors had missed, no overlooked clue or forgotten witness that might break the case open. The tips continued to come in sporadically, each one requiring follow-up no matter how unlikely. Sarah Beth had been seen in Florida, working at a beach resort. She'd been spotted in Tennessee living under a different name. Someone claimed she'd run away to join a religious commune in North Carolina. Every report was investigated, every lead pursued until it dissolved into mistaken identity or deliberate fabrication. People who wanted attention, or genuinely believed they'd seen someone who looked like the girl in the missing person posters that still hung in shop windows throughout Fairhope, her face fading in the sunlight until it became almost ghostly. Michael Collins tried to move forward with his life, in the way people do after tragedy, not because the pain lessened, but because existence demanded it. He worked at his father's hardware store, going through the motions of normality while carrying grief like a stone in his pocket, something heavy and permanent that never left him. He dated occasionally over the years, women from neighboring towns who knew about Sarah Beth but thought maybe enough time had passed, but nothing ever developed into anything serious. People whispered that he was still in love with a ghost, unable to commit to the present because he remained trapped in that October night when his future had disappeared without explanation. The Thornton house on Magnolia Avenue became a kind of shrine. Sarah Beth's bedroom was left exactly as it had been the day she vanished. Her clothes still hanging in the closet, her high school yearbook stacked on the desk, photographs covering every surface like evidence of a life interrupted. Patricia cleaned it weekly, dusting around the belongings with a reverence usually reserved for religious spaces, unable to accept that her daughter might never return to claim these artifacts of her existence. Gerald withdrew into himself, spending long hours in his workshop, building nothing in particular, just keeping his hands busy so his mind wouldn't have space to dwell on all the terrible possibilities. Jennifer Thornton graduated from Fairhope High in 1996, walking across the same stage her sister had crossed 4 years earlier, but the achievement felt hollow without Sarah Beth in the audience cheering for her. She left for college in Birmingham that fall, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of her hometown's collective memory, the way people still looked at her with pity and whispered when she passed. The guilt of survival followed her, though irrational, the persistent feeling that she should have done something different that night, should have noticed something wrong, should have somehow prevented the unpreventable. By 1998, 5 years after the disappearance, the case had effectively gone cold in every practical sense. Hamilton had retired the previous year, his replacement showing polite interest in the file, but lacking the personal investment that had driven the original investigation. The evidence boxes sat in the climate-controlled storage room, organized and labeled, waiting for technology or luck or divine intervention to make sense of their contents. The hair samples and fingerprints remained preserved but useless. The forensic science advanced, but not yet accessible to small departments with limited budgets, and no active leads to justify the expense of advanced testing. Detective Marcus Thompson arrived at the Fairhope Police Department in January 2017, transferred from a position in Atlanta where he'd worked cold cases for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. He was 43 years old, methodical and patient, the kind of investigator who believed that unsolved cases weren't necessarily unsolvable, just waiting for the right combination of technology and persistence. The current chief, Elizabeth Morgan, had hired him specifically to review old cases, to bring fresh perspective and modern techniques to investigations that had stalled before such resources existed. The Sarah Beth Thornton case was one of 17 cold cases Thompson inherited, but something about it caught his attention immediately. Perhaps it was the age of the victim, perhaps the circumstances of her disappearance from such a public location, or perhaps just the instinct developed over 2 decades in law enforcement that told him there were answers here if he knew where to look. He spent his first month simply reading, going through every report and statement and photograph, building a mental map of that October night and the investigation that followed. He noted where the original detectives had focused their efforts and where they might have been led astray by assumptions or limited resources. The evidence storage room had been reorganized several times over the years, boxes relocated and inventoried as the department expanded and modernized. In March 2018, during one such reorganization, a facilities worker named David Walsh discovered a cardboard box that had been misfiled, stuck behind a cabinet in a section of the room that wasn't climate-controlled. The box was labeled with a case number and date that meant nothing to Walsh, but when he pulled it out and opened it, he found a collection of VHS tapes, their labels faded but still legible, marked with names and dates from October 1993. Thompson was called down to the storage room immediately. The tapes had been logged into evidence by Detective Chambers 25 years earlier, video recordings of witness interviews conducted in the days following Sarah Beth's disappearance. They'd been reviewed at the time, statements transcribed into written reports, but the tapes themselves had been filed away and apparently forgotten. As technology evolved and VHS became obsolete, no one had thought to digitize these recordings, and they'd simply gathered dust in storage until being accidentally misplaced during some long-ago reorganization. The challenge was finding equipment to play them. The department had long since discarded its VHS players, and Thompson had to borrow one from a local library, an old machine that still functioned despite its age. He set it up in an unused conference room and began working through the tapes systematically, watching hours of grainy footage showing carnival workers and fairgoers being interviewed by Hamilton and Chambers. Their voices were tinny through the agging tape, the image quality degraded by time but still viewable. Most of the interviews contained nothing new, just confirmation of the written statements already in the file. Thompson watched them anyway, looking for body language and tone, the subtle tells that didn't always translate to written transcripts. He noted who seemed nervous and who seemed overly casual, who made eye contact and who avoided it, building profiles in his mind of people who'd been questioned a quarter-century ago and had long since scattered to unknown locations. It was the 14th tape, an interview conducted on October 30th, 1993, that made Thompson sit forward in his chair. The subject was Michael Collins, Sarah Beth's fiancé, recorded during what appeared to be his third formal interview with detectives. He looked exhausted in the footage, dark circles under his eyes, his hair uncombed, wearing the same shirt he'd apparently been wearing for days. Chambers was conducting the interview, her voice patient but probing, walking him through his timeline for that Saturday evening once again. Collins repeated the same story he'd told before, working at the hardware store until 9:15, driving to the fairgrounds, waiting for Sarah Beth who never appeared. But there was a moment about 18 minutes into the interview where Chambers asked him an unexpected question. She asked if he and Sarah Beth had argued recently, about anything at all, even something small. Collins hesitated for just a fraction of a second, his eyes moving to the left before he answered. No, everything had been fine between them. They'd been planning their wedding and looking forward to their future together. Thompson rewound the tape and watched that moment again. The hesitation was brief, maybe 2 seconds, easily missed or dismissed as someone gathering their thoughts, but it was there, a tiny crack in the otherwise consistent narrative. He checked the written transcript of the interview and found that this moment wasn't noted, just Collins's verbal response recorded without mention of the pause or the eye movement that preceded it. It was the kind of detail that video captured, but written reports often missed, the kind of small inconsistency that meant nothing by itself, but might mean something when viewed through the lens of 25 years of technological and investigative advances. Thompson continued through the remaining tapes, finding 3 more interviews with Collins conducted over the following weeks. In each one, when asked about his relationship with Sarah Beth, there was that same tiny hesitation, that same almost imperceptible pause before he affirmed that everything had been perfect between them. The transcripts recorded his words, but not these micro-expressions of doubt, these momentary cracks in the facade of the grieving fiancé, whose testimony had never been seriously questioned because he'd passed a polygraph and had a solid alibi and seemed genuinely devastated by the loss. Detective Thompson understood that micro-expressions and hesitations on decades-old videotape weren't enough to reopen a case that had consumed countless hours of investigative work and led nowhere. He needed something concrete, something that could be tested and verified, something that would justify the expense and effort of pursuing a new direction in an investigation that most people considered permanently unsolvable. The evidence boxes from 1993 contained physical materials that had been carefully preserved, but never subjected to the kind of forensic analysis that was now routine in criminal investigations, techniques that hadn't existed or weren't accessible to small-town police departments when Sarah Beth Thornton disappeared. The hair samples collected from various carnival workers' trailers had been stored properly, sealed in paper envelopes, and kept in temperature-controlled conditions that preserved their integrity even after 25 years. Thompson catalogued 17 distinct samples, each labeled with the location where it was found and the date of collection. Most of them were too degraded or contaminated to be useful even with modern technology, but 3 samples stood out: longer strands with intact follicles that had been recovered from Curtis Dawes' trailer, the ride operator whose card game alibi had been corroborated by 3 other workers, but never fully satisfied the original investigators. In April 2018, Thompson submitted a formal request to the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences for DNA analysis of these samples, along with a request for familial DNA comparison against any samples in the national database. The technology had advanced dramatically since 1993, when DNA testing was expensive and time-consuming, and typically reserved for cases with clear suspects and solid evidence. Now, even degraded samples could yield usable genetic profiles, and databases containing millions of profiles made it possible to identify not just exact matches, but family relationships, genetic connections that could lead investigators in entirely new directions. Results came back in June, and they changed everything Thompson thought he knew about the case. The hair samples from Dawes' trailer didn't belong to Sarah Beth Thornton, they belonged to Michael Collins. The DNA was an exact match to a sample Collins had voluntarily provided during the original investigation, preserved in evidence along with samples from dozens of other people who'd been interviewed and cleared. The presence of his hair in a carnival worker's trailer wasn't impossible to explain. Collins had attended the fair that night and could have theoretically come into contact with Doyle or been in that trailer for some innocent reason, but it raised questions that the original investigation had never thought to ask. Thompson requested additional testing on other physical evidence collected from the fairgrounds that October night: a cigarette butt found near where the bracelet was discovered, a partial fingerprint lifted from a payphone near the entrance, a small fabric fiber caught on a fence post along the route the bloodhounds had tracked. The cigarette butt yielded nothing useful, too degraded by exposure to weather and time. The fingerprint was too partial to identify anyone conclusively, but the fabric fiber, a tiny thread of denim that matched the jacket Sarah Beth had been wearing that night, contained epithelial cells that preserved enough genetic material for analysis. The DNA from those cells also belonged to Michael Collins, not mixed with Sarah Beth's DNA as would be expected from simple contact between an engaged couple who spent time together, but his DNA alone, transferred to her jacket through contact that had been forceful enough to tear a thread loose and leave behind skin cells. Thompson sent the evidence to a forensic specialist in Birmingham, who confirmed what seemed increasingly impossible to dismiss. The fiber suggested a struggle, physical contact, more violent than a casual embrace or the kind of touching that characterized a normal romantic relationship. Thompson began reconstructing Michael Collins's movements on October 26, 1993, with the kind of scrutiny that the original investigation had never applied to someone who'd been considered a grieving victim rather than a potential suspect. Collins had told investigators he worked at the hardware store until 9:15, but Thompson discovered that Robert Collins, his father, had actually left the store around 8:30 that evening to attend a church meeting. There was a 45-minute window where Michael had been alone at the store, no witnesses to confirm his presence, no customers coming in that late on a Saturday night when everyone was at the fair. The drive from Collins Hardware to the fairgrounds took 12 minutes. If Michael had left the store at 8:35, he could have arrived at the fair by 8:50, more than an hour earlier than he'd claimed. The payphone near the entrance had records showing a call made to the Thornton residence at 8:42 that evening, a detail noted in the original investigation, but attributed to one of many calls being made throughout the night. Patricia Thornton had been interviewed extensively about phone calls that evening and had mentioned that someone had called asking for Sarah Beth around 8:45, but when she went to get her daughter, the caller had hung up. Thompson obtained phone records from October 1993, a process that required working with the telephone company's legal department to access archives that had been transferred to digital storage but still existed. The call to the Thornton house at 8:42 originated from the payphone at the fairgrounds. The same phone showed another call at 9:03, this one to Collins Hardware, lasting less than 10 seconds. Someone at the fair had called the hardware store, possibly checking if Michael was still there, possibly Michael himself creating an alibi by calling his own workplace to establish a timeline that placed him somewhere other than where he actually was. The forensic evidence was compelling but circumstantial. DNA that proved contact but not necessarily guilt, timeline discrepancies that suggested deception but didn't constitute proof of a crime. Thompson needed more. He needed to understand motive and opportunity. He needed to find the piece of information that would transform suspicious coincidences into a prosecutable case. He began interviewing people who'd known Michael and Sarah Beth in 1993, now middle-aged and scattered across Alabama and neighboring states, asking questions that hadn't seemed relevant 25 years ago, but took on new significance in light of the DNA evidence. Lisa Montgomery had been Sarah Beth's closest friend since 7th grade, the kind of friendship forged in the crucible of adolescence and maintained through the daily intimacy of shared secrets and synchronized schedules. She'd moved to Nashville in 1995, married a session musician, built a life far removed from the tragedy that had defined her last years in Fairhope. When Detective Thompson called her in July 2018, she was 43 years old, managing a bookstore and raising 2 teenagers. She hadn't thought deeply about Sarah Beth Thornton in years. The memory was sealed away like something too painful to examine directly. Thompson drove to Nashville to interview her in person, understanding that some conversations required physical presence, the ability to read body language, and create the kind of rapport that phone calls couldn't establish. They met at her bookstore after closing, sitting in the cafe area with coffee growing cold between them. Thompson asked her to think back to the weeks before Sarah Beth disappeared, to remember anything unusual about her friend's behavior or her relationship with Michael Collins. Lisa's initial responses were what he expected, defensive of her dead friend and her friend's fiancé, insisting that their relationship had been solid and loving, exactly what it appeared to be. But as the conversation continued, as Thompson gently pressed her to think beyond the official narrative everyone had accepted for 25 years, something shifted in Lisa's expression. She remembered a conversation she'd had with Sarah Beth approximately 3 weeks before the disappearance, sitting in Lisa's car outside the fabric store where Sarah Beth worked. They'd been discussing wedding plans, going over guest lists and color schemes, the kind of mundane details that filled the months before a wedding. Sarah Beth had suddenly gone quiet, staring out the window at nothing, and when Lisa asked what was wrong, she'd hesitated before saying that sometimes she wondered if Michael was really ready to get married, if there was something he wasn't telling her. Lisa had pressed for details, but Sarah Beth had brushed it off, claiming she was just having pre-wedding jitters, the normal anxiety that came with making such a permanent commitment. But there'd been something in her voice, Lisa now recalled, something that suggested the concern went deeper than ordinary nervousness. She'd mentioned seeing Michael talking to someone at a gas station a few days earlier, a woman she didn't recognize, and the way he'd ended the conversation quickly when he noticed Sarah Beth watching had seemed odd, almost furtive. Thompson asked Lisa if she'd ever told investigators about this conversation, and she admitted she hadn't, not because she was deliberately withholding information, but because at the time it had seemed insignificant, the kind of minor relationship concern that every couple experienced, and that couldn't possibly be relevant to Sarah Beth's disappearance from a crowded fairground in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, when everyone was focused on carnival workers and stranger abduction scenarios. The idea that Michael Collins might have had secrets seemed absurd, almost insulting to his obvious grief. Thompson returned to Fairhope and began investigating Michael Collins's life in the months before October 1993 with renewed focus. He obtained financial records, medical records, any documentation that might reveal aspects of Collins's life that hadn't been examined during the original investigation. What he found was a series of cash withdrawals from Collins's personal account, small amounts of $50 or $75 taken out weekly throughout the summer and early fall of 1993, totaling nearly $1,500 by October. When interviewed in 1993, Collins had explained these withdrawals as wedding-related expenses, purchasing items for the apartment he and Sarah Beth were planning to rent, but no receipts or documentation existed to support these explanations. Thompson began talking to people who'd worked at Collins Hardware in 1993, tracking down former employees who might remember details about Michael's behavior that year. He located Janet Wheeler, who'd worked as a cashier at the hardware store for 6 years before moving to Florida in 1994. She remembered Michael Collins as a decent boss and a reliable worker, but she also remembered something that hadn't seemed important at the time. There'd been a woman who came into the store occasionally that summer, always when Robert Collins was out and usually near closing time. She'd asked for Michael specifically, claiming she needed advice on various household projects, but Janet had noticed that she never actually purchased much. Her visits seemed more social than commercial. Janet described the woman as probably in her late 20s or early 30s, married based on the wedding ring she wore, attractive in a way that made Janet wonder why she was spending so much time talking to a young engaged man in a nearly empty hardware store. The visits had stopped sometime in September, Janet thought, or maybe early October. She couldn't remember exactly. She'd mentioned it once to another employee, joking about Michael having an admirer, but it had never seemed serious enough to mention to anyone in authority, certainly not to the police investigating his fiancée's disappearance. Thompson obtained the 1993 customer database from Collins Hardware, a primitive computer system that tracked purchases over $50. He found a name that appeared multiple times between June and September, Rebecca Hoffman, address listed as a rural route outside Fairhope. Property records showed that Rebecca and Daniel Hoffman owned 47 acres of farmland, approximately 8 miles from town, land that had been in Daniel's family for 3 generations. Rebecca Hoffman would have been 31 years old in 1993, married for 9 years, no children listed in census records. A discreet inquiry revealed that Rebecca and Daniel Hoffman still lived on that property, now in their 50s, still married according to public records. Thompson needed to approach this carefully, understanding that he was essentially investigating an extramarital affair that might have occurred 25 years ago, that might have no connection to Sarah Beth's disappearance, but that represented the first genuine lead in a case that had been cold for longer than many of his fellow officers had been alive. He needed more evidence before confronting either Michael Collins or Rebecca Hoffman, needed to build a case that could withstand the inevitable defense arguments about ancient history and circumstantial evidence. Detective Thompson spent 3 months building his case, with the kind of methodical patience that separated successful cold case investigations from exercises in futility. He obtained search warrants for phone records from 1993, working with telecommunications companies to retrieve archive data that existed only on deteriorating magnetic tapes in climate-controlled warehouses. The records revealed a pattern of calls between Michael Collins's home phone and the Hoffman residence, always during weekday afternoons, when Daniel Hoffman would have been working his construction job in Mobile, calls lasting anywhere from 15 minutes to over an hour, occurring 2 or 3 times weekly between May and October of 1993. In September 2018, Thompson brought Michael Collins in for what he described as a routine follow-up interview regarding new forensic techniques being applied to his fiancée's case. Collins arrived at the police station looking remarkably similar to how he'd appeared in those 1993 videotapes, just older, his dark hair now threaded with grey, his face carrying the weight of 25 years but still recognizably the same young man who'd reported his fiancée missing on that October night. He came willingly, even seemed eager to help, telling Thompson he'd never stopped hopping for answers about what happened to Sarah Beth. Thompson began slowly, reviewing the timeline Collins had provided in 1993, asking him to recall details with the understanding that memory faded over decades and small inconsistencies were natural. Collins repeated the same story he'd told countless times, working late at the hardware store, arriving at the fairgrounds around 9:35, searching for Sarah Beth who never appeared. His voice carried the practiced smoothness of someone who told this narrative so many times it had become truth through repetition, a story worn smooth like stones in a river, all the rough edges polished away by years of retelling. Then Thompson placed the DNA report on the table between them. He explained in technical detail how Collins's hair had been found in Curtis Doyle's trailer, how his genetic material had been recovered from the denim fiber torn from Sarah Beth's jacket, how these discoveries suggested a physical altercation that Collins had never mentioned in any of his statements. Thompson watched Collins's face carefully, noting the way color drained from his cheeks, the way his hands moved from relaxed on the table to clenched in his lap, the way his breathing changed from steady to shallow. Collins tried to explain the hair evidence as contamination, claiming he might have been in that trailer for some innocent reason he couldn't now recall, but his voice lacked conviction. When Thompson pressed him about the fiber evidence, about the force required to tear fabric and leave behind epithelial cells, Collins went silent for nearly a minute, his eyes fixed on the table's surface as if he might find answers written in the wood grain. Thompson let the silence extend, understanding that sometimes the space between words revealed more than the words themselves. Finally, Collins asked for a lawyer, and the interview ended, but Thompson had seen something in that minute of silence. A recognition that the past he'd carefully constructed was collapsing, that evidence he'd assumed would never exist was now sitting in a folder bearing his name. 2 days later, Collins's attorney contacted the district attorney's office, indicating that his client wished to make a statement in exchange for consideration regarding charges. The negotiation took 3 weeks, lawyers and prosecutors arguing over terms, while Thompson continued investigating, building the case stronger with each passing day. On October 15, 2018, Michael Collins returned to the police station with his attorney and a court reporter, and he began to tell a different story than the one he'd maintained for 25 years. He confirmed that he'd been having an affair with Rebecca Hoffman, that it had started in April 1993, when she'd come into the hardware store asking for help selecting paint colors, and he'd found himself attracted to her in a way that confused and frightened him. The relationship had intensified over the summer, stolen hours at her farmhouse when her husband was working, phone calls that grew longer and more intimate, a connection that felt both thrilling and catastrophic. Sarah Beth had discovered the affair 3 days before she disappeared. Collins admitted she'd found phone bills with repeated calls to a number she didn't recognize, had confronted him about it, and he'd broken down and confessed everything. She'd been devastated, had told him the engagement was over, that she needed time to think about what she wanted to do. They'd agreed to attend the fair that Saturday night to talk, to see if there was any way to salvage what they'd had, but Collins claimed he'd arrived with no real hope of reconciliation, just a desperate need to make her understand that the affair had meant nothing, that he'd made a terrible mistake. According to his statement, they'd met near the carousel around 9:00, not 9:35 as he'd previously claimed. They'd walked toward the back of the fairgrounds where they could talk privately away from people who knew them and might overhear. The conversation had escalated into an argument. Sarah Beth told him she couldn't marry someone she couldn't trust. Collins begged her to forgive him, to give him another chance. He admitted grabbing her arm when she tried to walk away, admitted that her jacket had torn in his grip, admitted that she'd pulled free and told him she was going to tell everyone what he'd done, that she wouldn't let him play the victim while she carried the shame of his betrayal. But Collins claimed that's where his memory ended. Clearly, he said Sarah Beth had walked away from him, disappearing into the crowd, and he'd returned to his truck and driven home, too distraught to think clearly. He claimed he'd gone back to the fair later around 9:30, hoping to find her and apologize, and when he couldn't locate her, he'd simply waited by the entrance, eventually reporting her missing when she never appeared. He swore he didn't know what happened to her after she walked away from him, swore he'd assumed she'd gone home or gone somewhere to calm down, swore he'd never imagined that she wouldn't be found safe. Thompson didn't believe Collins's partial confession. The convenient memory gap that absolved him of everything except infidelity and a brief argument. The detective had seen too many guilty people offer partial truths, admitting to what could be proven while denying what remained speculative, hoping that a display of honesty about minor sins would create credibility regarding major ones. But Collins's statement had given Thompson leverage to pursue Rebecca Hoffman, the woman who'd remained invisible in the original investigation, whose connection to the case had been hidden behind the assumption that carnival workers represented the only viable suspects. Rebecca Hoffman was brought in for questioning on October 22, 2018, and she arrived with an attorney and an expression of barely concealed terror. Thompson had done his research thoroughly, understanding that 25 years of living with secrets created their own kind of pressure, that people who carried guilt for decades sometimes welcomed the opportunity to finally speak the truth, even if that truth destroyed everything they'd built. He explained to Rebecca Hoffman that the time for denial had passed. Michael Collins had already confessed to the affair. Phone records, witness statements, and months of quiet investigation had confirmed what she still tried to hide. Her cooperation, he told her calmly but firmly, might be the only thing standing between her walking out of the room with a deal or being charged as an accessory to murder. It was a sobering choice, one that hung heavy in the stale air of the interrogation room. Hoffman's statement, when it finally came, unraveled over 6 long hours filled with tears, silence, and whispered consultations with her attorney. By the end, what emerged was a confession that painted the full, tragic picture of Sarah Beth Thornton's disappearance, a story of obsession, betrayal, and irreversible choices. Rebecca admitted the affair without hesitation. She spoke of how she had fallen for Michael Collins completely, recklessly, in a way that burned through all sense of reason. She had loved him with a desperation that eclipsed judgment, convincing herself that what they shared was real, something purer than his engagement to Sarah Beth, something worth the risk. She knew about Sarah Beth, of course she did, but she believed that, given enough time, Michael would choose her. He just needed space. He just needed courage. But on the afternoon of October 26, 1993, everything changed. Michael called her, his voice trembling with panic. Sarah Beth had found out about the affair. She was furious, threatening to expose them both, to tell Daniel Hoffman, Rebecca's husband, and to make sure the whole town knew the truth. Michael said he needed her help that night, asked her to meet him at the fairgrounds. He said he just needed her there as backup, though he never explained what that meant. And because she couldn't bear the thought of losing him, she agreed. Rebecca drove to the fair around 8:30 that night, parking near the back entrance where the carnival workers kept their trucks. The fair was still alive with light and sound, the smell of fried dough in the air, the laughter of teenagers echoing over the rides, but Rebecca felt only dread. She waited in the dark, hands clenched around the steering wheel, heart hammering in her chest, telling herself that whatever Michael needed, she'd do it. Then, just after 9, she saw him. He appeared out of the crowd, half carrying, half dragging Sarah Beth. The girl looked dazed, her movements sluggish and uneven, as if she'd been drinking or was ill. Rebecca would later say that, in that moment, she still didn't understand what was happening. Michael told her they just needed to talk to Sarah Beth privately, to calm her down, to convince her not to destroy everyone's lives with a single confession. Rebecca opened the truck door. Michael laid Sarah Beth in the back seat. Then they drove, through winding country roads and quiet fields, to Rebecca's farm, far from the noise and lights of the fair. In the dim light of the barnyard, things fell apart. Michael tried to reason with Sarah Beth, his voice breaking as he begged her not to tell anyone. He told her he was sorry, that it had been a mistake, that he still wanted to marry her. But Sarah Beth wouldn't relent. She told him she couldn't marry someone who had betrayed her trust, that she would tell the truth no matter what it cost. The argument escalated, shouting, tears, pleading. And then, in a moment of rage and desperation, Michael snapped. He grabbed her, shaking her, trying to quiet her. Rebecca screamed for him to stop. Sarah Beth stumbled backward, fell hard, her head striking a rock with a sound that neither of them would ever forget. Silence followed, cold, absolute silence. Sarah Beth didn't move. Panic consumed them. Michael dropped to his knees, shaking her shoulders, calling her name, but there was no response. Rebecca wanted to call for help, but Michael stopped her, insisting it was too late, that no one would believe it was an accident. They were both trembling, both crying. And then, instead of calling the police, instead of doing the right thing, they made the decision that would seal both their fates. They buried Sarah Beth in a shallow grave on the edge of Rebecca's property, alone, under the quiet stars of that October night, praying that no one would ever find her. Rebecca's statement filled in every missing detail of the mystery that had haunted Fairhope for nearly 3 decades. It was the key that finally unlocked the case. Detective Thompson and his team worked tirelessly to corroborate her confession, examining timelines, matching evidence, testing soil samples from the farm. Piece by piece, the story came together until there was no doubt left. Michael Collins was arrested and charged with the murder of Sarah Beth Thornton. Rebecca Hoffman was charged as an accessory after the fact. The trial that followed was long, brutal, and deeply emotional. Decades of secrecy unraveled in a single courtroom, where jurors listened in stunned silence to the story of love gone wrong. In March 2020, justice finally arrived. Michael Collins was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rebecca Hoffman received a lesser sentence for her role in concealing the crime, a decision that brought as much sorrow as it did closure. For Patricia Thornton, Sarah Beth's mother, the verdict was both an ending and a wound that would never fully heal. She could finally visit her daughter's grave knowing the truth, knowing the man who took her child's life would never walk free again. For Detective Thompson, the case was a lesson in endurance, a reminder that truth can survive even the longest silence, that justice, though delayed, can still arrive like dawn after an endless night. And for the people of Fairhope, the story of Sarah Beth Thornton became more than a tragedy. It became a testament to how deeply secrets can run, how they can twist love into ruin, and how, no matter how long the darkness lasts, the truth always finds its way back into the light.